So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing. And it occurred to me as I was going over my notes that I'm going to try and encapsulate 10 years worth of work in 15 minutes worth of talk. I don't know if those of you who've tried to do this, whether you've actually succeeded. We'll see if I am able to pull this off. I discovered this morning that I actually had a lot of stuff already written when I was thinking about trying to make sense out of this. So I'm in better shape than I thought I was going to be. Let me just give you a little bit of background about myself and explain to you how I got into this business. I'm trained as a criminologist and I've been very active in looking at issues around crime and victimization. I was the dean of the School of Criminal Justice for 9 years at Rutgers. And then in early 2000, 9/11 happened. We could see it across the river, actually, from where we were. And then things got sort of interesting from a research and collaborative point of view. So we discovered that there was, as you all know, there was an increasing awareness that we didn't know very much about risk to terrorism, what the threats were. And then we discovered we didn't know a lot about a lot of other types of security issues as well. And so I looked around, tried to find people who would get involved in doing research on this, and I said we would set up a center. The chancellor at the time was very interested in doing this. We would become sort of a representative group on our campus to a larger initiative at Rutgers University on Homeland Security. So I cast around for various people in my school who'd be interested in doing this, and I found none. Nobody volunteered. And then I thought, well, you know, this would be pretty interesting. Maybe I'll try doing this. And so I got involved, and I ended up being the director of the center as well as staying on as the dean. And then when I stepped down as dean, I stayed on as director. But what I spent a lot of time doing in the first few years was going to various meetings with various groups of people who were outside of my area of discipline, who were not criminologists, and discovering that they too were struggling with some of these issues around how do you identify and manage threats? How do you prepare? How do you give government officials information and ideas for prevention? Because of course everybody was very focused on, well, we got to stop this from happening again. I ended up in rooms with applied mathematicians and computer scientists and engineers. And it was quite interesting because in many ways they knew all about statistics and data, but I knew about the subject area, as it turns out. I knew a lot more about what they were worried about than they did. For applied mathematicians, and this is not a criticism, they will apply mathematics to anything. Birds fly, dolphins swim, terrorist attack, they'll have an algorithm for it. So it was interesting to deal with them because they thought that they could just mine data and they can identify. And I thought, no, it's got to be more complicated than this, or at least it has to be more intuitive, more theoretical than this. And so I started to think about how we might get ourselves into a framework that would make much more sense out of the front end of this problem, which is how do you identify what the risks are? How do you identify what the consequences of those risks are? And how do you identify where our vulnerabilities are? And as it turns out, that threat, vulnerability, and consequence is really the core of what's in this discipline is called risk and risk assessment. So risk assessment talks about threat. Now the threat could be anything, depending on which area you're working in. Vulnerability talks about who's going to likely be affected by this. And vulnerability can be influenced by exposure. And consequence, of course, is, well, what happens afterwards. And consequence can not only be related to prevention, but can be related to things like recovery and so on. So this is really a big area. And when you start thinking about how you're going to start making sense out of this, you get a little sort of confused and say, well, somebody's bound to have thought about this. somebody's bound to have figured out some of these questions. Connected to this is this whole issue about, well, if they have started to think about these questions, what are they telling people who are actually responding? What are they telling the Prime Minister's office, or what are they telling the program officers and so on about what they should be thinking about and how they should manage the information? And how do they help them inform resource allocation? So this was the beginning of the journey, sort of. And we've done a lot of things related to this topic area. I've continued to do my work on crime analysis, and we're actually doing an extensive amount of work on what's called predictive policing. I don't know if some of you in the room know about this. I didn't think that this group was going to be that interested in the predictive policing part, but I'm going to show you some of the methodology we're using for that, which I think applies to this issue related to risk assessment and decision making. But, okay, so the other part of this is, part of the dilemma that we run into with the security issues writ large, particularly if you're focusing on terrorism or even natural events, disasters, is that they don't happen that often, right? And so you have a very high intensity event that comes and occurs on a low frequency basis. And so you have problems that come from that, just in terms of trying to make sense out of, so how do I develop models, how do I develop analysis strategies around high intensity, low intensity, low frequency, high intensity, low frequency events. And what we are normally doing is we're dealing with, in the crime area, we're dealing with high intensity, high frequency, low intensity events. A single crime event is not as significant as a single terrorism event. So we've had to adapt a little bit, and so the question comes out is, how scalable are the issues related to coming from low intensity, so high intensity, high frequency, low intensity events, to these incidents that occur on a less intense basis, less frequent basis, but more intense. Now that was all very confused, but I think you got the idea. So the idea is how important are global factors, the larger factors that don't happen that often but have high consequence? How can they be interpreted and managed at the local level, and vice versa? So we have a lot of things going on through this whole package. And the only thing that I could think of that could make sense out of this was thinking about it in terms of risk. You know, at one point I had colleagues, they would run down the halls the opposite direction because I got onto this, it's all about risk, you know, it's all about risk. I said, you gotta stop talking about this. But it turns out it's all about risk. It really, you know, if you think about how you would approach, or how we approach many things in our lives, we think we do it in a deterministic way, but we actually don't. We do things very probabilistically. We learn scripts, we learn how to do things, but we do that on the basis of the likelihood of these things occurring in a certain way, are calculated and help guide our behavior. That's true as well in the areas, as I discovered, in the areas of security. That what we're discovering, and what we discovered, was that lots of agencies, lots of groups now are thinking about, and I just found out that the Prime Minister's office in Australia is thinking about this as well in these terms, is thinking about it in terms of risk. Now, why risk? Well, risk actually provides you with a metric. It provides you with a basis for actually measuring the amount of whatever it is, concern, response, you can put a dollar figure on it. It's a metric, and it's a metric that doesn't change from group to group, but actually can be sort of, it manages across groups because you're able to actually calculate it in a way that makes sense to all the different groups. So in our analysis with crime, for example, we think of victims thinking in terms of their own personal risk, but offenders think in terms of risk. And so do police officers think in terms of risk. And so the question is, when they all come together, how do they manage their collaborative risk? So risk, what do you need to do if you're thinking about risk? Well, you need to identify the risk factors, vulnerabilities, and capabilities. You have to estimate a risk level. You have to evaluate the risks. You can perform, as Brenda does, a socioeconomic analysis of the risk, but you can also do a social analysis of risk. You have to establish priorities, and then you have to set an acceptable level of risk, because there's always risk. There's never a situation where there's no risk, right? Unless you live in a bubble, and even then, chances that the bubble will go away. You have to elaborate on scenarios and measures, and you have to get everybody to agree on how to respond. So as we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about it in terms of well, we start on the global level, so I might as well start my presentation. This is the risk balance. So the idea is, at one level, you identify the risk, and you go through this process, which I'll show you. And the other side, you identify ways in which you're going to develop means to respond to that risk. Now, as we go through this, I start with the global threats. So threats emerge from states and non-state actors, from global to regional to individual. So this idea of, if you're thinking in terms of these global threats, how do they get translated from those higher levels down to the individual levels? And then crossing over this are these factors related to things like globalization and communication technology, changes in migration patterns, all the things that makes this complicated, but actually set in this framework, it can actually make some sense. So to go to that, then we think, okay, so what then are we worried about? What are the factors that we are going to try and think about? Well, global risk assessment can include anything. And this is what makes this it's a big problem, and one that we will struggle with a lot, but I think if we could start trying to bring it together in one framework, it'll make a little bit more sense. These are the different types of assessments: cyber terror, infrastructure, what needs to be protected, sovereignty, business concerns, health and terror, social conditions, poverty and disorder, and other, may reflect other standards and measures of risk. What we have is, we have out there just sort of a gigantic array of different types of risks. And we're seeing increasingly that nations and public policy officials are grappling with which of these risks are the most threatening, which are the ones that they can do the most or anything about. This, by the way, is now #1 on the list. This one here, cyber terror. It's interesting because how it's ascended above the other ones in terms of the general discussion about risk. So risk assessment then becomes a product of looking at threat, vulnerability, and consequences in conditions of uncertainty, and the unsure resources to respond and unsure responses to respond. I can't let this go by without talking about the Rumsfeld, there are known knowns, and then there are the unknown unknowns, or something like this. But actually, it was really prescient, because in a lot of ways it says, well, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and we need to be able to account for that. But you know, interestingly enough, risk and risk analysis is directed towards reducing uncertainty. That's the whole idea. Now, where does this all take us? Well, I thought, given this rather confusing, and maybe it was the applied mathematicians that drove me to distractions, that I just needed to do something. I thought, well, this looks really confusing and really complicated, but I bet you there's something in here that somebody's done already, that basically that we can learn from. Now, what I did discover is that different groups were maybe doing risk assessment, but they were all doing it sort of in a different way. There was no common, there didn't seem to be any coordinated effort. Forget about the common, but there was no coordinated effort, at least at the time when we started looking at this. I said, well, let's take a look at the areas where there seems to be a lot of attention paid to trying to prepare, at least after, when everybody started to realize they they needed to get themselves organized to respond to these threats. A lot of things changed, and I'm thinking in particular, the example I remember hearing a lot about in these meetings that I was going to, related to public health. So the public health business, at least in the United States, was very, they had a lot of information, they had a lot of people working on forward thinking, but they had no integration. They had no real way of managing all the information that they were getting. They had no real rubric for figuring out, well, what are we going to do? And then what actually happened in New Jersey, where I am located, there was a large amount of money that was spent on building up their communication structures so that they were able to get a very quick response back from some of the sentinels that they had. But also they put it into a risk structure so that they were able to really respond very quickly to some of the problems that they were facing. So there was an interesting example there of how they managed to do this. So in looking at this common methodology, we thought we're going to go look at 3 different areas in which there presumably has been some work being done in this area, in this issue around risk. We looked at health, disease, we looked at disasters, and we looked at terrorism. And what we're trying to do is figure out what was common to each of those different areas, and what was different, and what did they actually what were they doing to integrate their decision making and make it so that they could go forward with this. There were 3 parts to this that came out of our preliminary look at this. One related to risk assessment, the second related to decision making, and the third related to risk management. And so these are important because this sets up, for me, where we want to go with this in the future. First part has to do with the risk assessment. What type of threat or hazard are we facing? What types of data are needed? And to me, the data part is really sort of the key element to this. What are the sources of information available? What's the level of certainty that the event will occur? How vulnerable are we? How exposed are we? So those questions about risk assessment get asked here. So that's the setup. That's where you start thinking about the problem that you may be having. Then you get to decision making, and decision making is who's in charge of evaluating the risk and making decisions? How is the authority established? What is the risk assessment that has been received from the local level? Has the risk been reassessed at a higher level, particularly with these agencies that are operating in these jurisdictions that have multiple levels of decision making? What are the priorities? And then importantly, what type of monitoring is going on? Can you really establish how well you're doing related to the monitoring process? Finally, you get into this risk management part, which I assume that the group here is most interested in, and that has to do with the governance issues. So when you actually have gone through your process, once the decisions are communicated to the individuals responsible to carry them out, is further communication to the lower levels required? Are the specific responsibilities of each level established? Are the data gathered and the effective implementation? And how is the effectiveness of the measures established? So this becomes the process, the adaptation and mitigation process. Okay, so you say, well, that's not all that unusual. People talk about this all the time in risk management. So what we wanted to do is simply apply it to these 3 different areas. So we looked at, I think this goes right here. We looked at, this isn't the best slide that I want to work in public health, but we looked at public health, particularly related to risk assessment around the pandemic influenza. And one of the things we realized was it was really hard to look at public health because it was just everywhere. So we decided to see what are the public health agencies doing related to very specific issues around something like a flu epidemic. That's the threat. So the threat becomes if there's an event that's detected, what happens? Well, it turns out that the this is the Red Cross. So this really should, the slide I should have put up is a slide related to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has very specific steps that you have to go through when you get to a certain stage in an influenza pandemic. And their data is very good. They collect it. The reason this is interesting, because you can see they're talking up here, and they're using the risk reduction, risk analysis style of language when they start to develop these types of goals. The decision making with the World Health Organization is highly integrated. All of the groups from the local levels to the national to the international levels are all in a chain, and their risk process works very, very effectively. And so they go from planning and conciliation to surveillance, investigation, and then they actually introduce a reaction, response. This is a slightly different example. This is an example from what's called GDAX. The Joint Research Center is an operation in the European Commission that has been heavily involved in trying to develop these sort of early warning systems. Again, a risk-based process. And the risk assessment, it works better or worse depending on what they're looking at. We took as an example flooding and discovered that the data around flooding was this one here. The data was pretty good, but they got into problems when they started to make decisions around what to do about the flooding, partly because that had to do with local issues. And then when you get down to the mitigation process, it became even more complicated. But there was at least some effort to try and integrate this. I find this an amazing process, that they're going through all of these really complicated data processing, decision processing, and integrating it together. But again, they're using it from the point of view of a risk analysis, trying to anticipate what's going to happen at the end of this. Then the one that I probably know more about than any of the others is, I'll forget about this for a second, is the crime part. So in the crime analysis, identifying threat, particularly if you're looking at terrorism, identifying threat is really complicated. It's really difficult. And so the risk assessments that were done early on were different from the health and the disaster ones, because the health and disasters are naturally occurring events, whereas terrorism is a social event, is a human activated event. And so it was really much harder for these agencies to try and anticipate what the threats were. And so what they did, and in some ways I think they went a little crazy, they just said, well, everything's a threat, and then we'll narrow it down from there. There's actually a big controversy, it's not as much as a controversy, but there's a shift, some of you will know, having gone through airports in the United States, that there's a lot of debate about how effectively the TSA operates. Now, the TSA is now shifting its focus away from so they're saying, we're going to identify the people who we think pose no risk. They're using exactly this strategy. But you're going to have to tell us who you are. So we'll identify who you are, and then we'll establish that you are not a risk to us. And then you go through quickly. And we're going to spend all our time focusing on the people who we don't know anything about. So in other words, those are the people we think are risky and create more threat. It's an uncertain process, I think, in some ways. But there's another part to this which makes it a little different from those other two approaches. There really is no real serious cross-national, international counterterrorism organization. There are agencies that share some crime data, that share some intelligence, but for the most part, these are nationally based responses. It's changing a little bit, but not tremendously, because national governments are suspicious of one another when it comes to this type of stuff. So the question then becomes, if they're not exchanging information like they are in the health area or in the disaster area, are they less effective? And my guess is that they probably are. But then there's the other issues that come up related to how far can you really go in trading information when you have issues related to civil rights and privacy issues and a range of other things, which causes a problem with some of this. So when we come through this, we see that there actually is sort of a common methodology. We could have used other examples from hurricanes and tsunami warnings and so on. But there is some common, that's the process that we showed you, I'll go back. That this actually does fit, and it works pretty well. And when it's, there's a common methodology that most organizations are working with. To me, the biggest problem, actually, interestingly enough, probably doesn't happen as much here. It happens here. It happens in the area of information gathering. And the real difficulty, and I'm going to show you this in a little while, the real difficulty we have in getting good information and getting accurate information that helps us identify what those threats are long before we actually get to the point of trying to respond to them. There is some difficulty that comes out of here. We did a study of, to continue with the terrorism theme, we did a study of all the terrorism, the research that was done around evaluating counterterrorism programs in the United States for a 10-year period. We identified 21,000 studies. By the time we got down, and we applied a standard to them to establish how methodologically correct they were, whether or not they actually used data to determine whether the program worked or not, and we found 7. So this evaluation part is probably not done all that well in many places as well. But again, to me though, that doesn't mean this isn't the right approach. It just means that we have a lot of work to do and try to make it better. So when we get to this, we say, all right, we have each of these agencies, each of these groups are doing this. There's a lot of, if you go online, you'll find there's a number of different agencies that are involved in these types of, we had a presentation from the State Department to us. They do this, they do a lot of risk assessment. There are lots of information available now, increasing information available coming online. They're starting to see this as really a way of making some more sense, so getting themselves ahead of some of these threats. Again, the biggest problem though is identifying the threats and getting good information related to that. But I think there's a common methodology emerging out of this, and I think it's quite interesting how it's coming forward. Now, from a research point of view, let's go past this. What I've talked to you about so far has been primarily focused around event analysis. And what we've been trying to do is expand away from just working strictly with events and thinking about other types of information that we could tie to these, particularly this problem about low occurring events. So taking advantage of some of the new data, the new technology that's available. So this is sort of, having said that, that there are these agencies doing this, they're using a common methodology, what would we need to do to move forward to make this work more effectively? And I think that increasingly, to me, as I said, the information gathering part is a critical part to this. But as we get more data and we start getting better visualization tools, it will become easier to integrate this into common decision making. One of the biggest problems you have when you get, I'm sure it may not be the biggest problems, there may be other things, but when you're going into to talk to an agency director or a politician, and you're trying to explain to them why they need to do certain things, and you put up a chart or a table, and it's got lots of data in it, and after you get the glazed over look, they say, well, what are we supposed to do? What do these data mean? Why are you making it so complicated? A visualization is a really cool tool to get you around that problem, and there's some very interesting ones available now. In the work that we're doing, we've focused very specifically on thinking about taking information and locating it around some particular focus. And in our case, we're locating it around location. We just think that that's something that helps us make sense out of events. And the spatial analysis tools that are available now are really good. A lot of the things that we talked about have a spatial reference point to them. The disasters, the terrorism threats, the public health threats. And we think that we can find the correlates, the issues that we think coexist with the event. We can find them more easily, and we can visualize them more easily through spatial analysis. And so this is where we've been going with some of this analysis. To start with, you need data. Once again, as I said, a lot of the data are becoming more easily available. If you go online, you can actually now download extensive data from the World Health Organization. They've made all their data available. You can get data through web crawlers. You can get this public data available from most major cities. It differs from country to country. Interestingly enough, in the United States, you can get almost any information now, including police data. In Canada, you have to swear your life off. You go through 17 levels of confidential checks in order to get crime data. I have no idea why. It's all publicly available. And some of the stuff just simply isn't available in Europe because they don't collect it. They don't collect it in a rigorous fashion. But where the information is available, this is a lot of the stuff actually is very useful because it's geolocated. It's got it geolocated, or you can geolocate it. And so you've already got a point to start. So you can start putting things around that geolocated data. There's one other form of data that, of course, is becoming more popular, and this is referred to as user-generated data. In the UN, they talk about it as, well, it's not smoke. They talk the data that just simply gets generated automatically. And again, my friends, the applied mathematicians, believe that they can make sense of anything, and so they'll find a pattern in that user-generated data. By this, we're talking about information related to things like Twitter feeds and the like, Facebook. I'm really curious about that part of the data feed part, by the way. I think it's interesting that we are so enamored by Twitter feeds. If you go on to some of these financial programs now, like Market Watch, at the bottom, they'll actually have something called a sentiment line. And that's tracking Twitter responses on that particular stock. And so that'll be going up and down. And they think that somehow or another, the Twitter feed is going to tell you something about the behavior of that stock. I think that's a little silly, but maybe I'm wrong. But the point is that it is actually an interesting correlate. They're looking for this. You would all know about the flu, the Google flu indicator, right? Have you heard about that? No? That's a great example. So the Google, what Google did was they track everything, all their searches, right? And what they discovered was, as they're going along, they discovered that they're around in the United States, late August, early September, that there was a large sort of spike of inquiries about flu. People were saying, this is going, what's flu? What are the symptoms? Blah, blah, blah. And it started to peak. And then they thought this was really interesting. So they went to look to see what might help explain this. And they discovered that 2 weeks later, there was, in those locations where those requests were coming in, the hospital emergency rooms were being flooded with people with flu symptoms. So this was basically people coming in there, trying to find out, do I have the flu or do I not? And then they actually got it, but they got it 2 weeks later. Google says this is actually a predictor of the flu outbreak. An interesting use of social data as a way of using it as a predictor. So there's a huge amount of work being done in this whole area around I remember talking to a computing science guy talking about these web crawlers. They go out and they scrape data. And I go, how do you scrape data? What is, and of course, they're going through and they're managing repeat events. And it's becoming more obvious as we see these in a lot of discussion that how this is being done. So what we've done to try and address this whole issue of creating an analytic around these forecasting techniques, given that the data are available and that we want to geolocate it, is we've created something called risk terrain modeling. And risk terrain modeling is an approach that uses terrain that creates the likelihood of insecurity at specific locations. Now, this is our attempt to actually take all the stuff I've been saying before and squeeze it into a framework that you could actually do some empirical testing on. So much of this work is done, is descriptive. A lot of the work that's done by the EU, the Euro monitors and the media monitors, basically they're just looking for spikes. They're not looking for, they want to find these correlates, but they don't have the technique for doing it. But we think that remember what I said about event-dependent analysis. We think that there's real value in getting away from the event-dependent process and looking at contextual processes. And as it turns out, the technology is now there, the data are starting to become available, but the technology is also now there to allow us to do this in a locationally specific geoanalysis, using a geoanalysis approach. I know that some of this stuff is already being done in the public health area. Some has been done it's popular in geology and so on, but we're trying to take this and put it into the context of threat assessment related to social events, and then, but also we think that it will have implications for other approaches as well. Our major focus, though, is on social outcomes. So what is risk terrain modeling? Well, this is really what it is. It's layering data. It's really layering data. And you say, okay, well, can you do that? Can you just take data and put it on top of one another? And it turns out you can. There are certain assumptions you have to make about this, but when we work at the micro level, when we're working with crime data, we're taking street segments, or not street segments. We're taking areas of 100 feet by 100 feet and identifying things like infrastructure. So where are the bars? Where are the drug markets? Where are the police interventions? Where are the schools? And you can actually then take this, identify a risk factor, those risk factors, give them a value, drop them onto a map, and when you get to the bottom, you can add it all up. And what you end up with is something called spatial influence, that these maps represent the coexistence of these factors in those locations. And if your theory is good, and your theory is going to, of course, be advanced by the analysis you do, you can start identifying and pulling apart what these important factors are, and then use those to predict where the events are going to take place. It becomes probabilistic, it becomes a prediction, but it's a process that you can do that's really, truly empirically based. We've done it with crime data, and the beauty of this is that you can choose different variables, different layers for different types of crime. We've got a program now that will actually statistically verify which is the best of the layers, and then gives you the best explained variance out of this, use it as a predictor. It will then provide you with a basis for identifying where you really should be going rather than going everywhere. That the areas that have those high levels of risk factors are the areas where you need to be focused. So go back to the issue of scalability. Can you scale this from the micro level analysis that we're doing, which is actually pretty good because we got lots of data, right? We got lots of good geographical data, at the city level. We've got lots of really good data from the police. The question is to address those other issues I've been talking about, like terrorism, disaster, socially developed problems. Can you use the same type of technique? Can you scale it up? And we've tried. So, but you have to have some sort of, you have to have some reason to include the variables you're including. You can't just sort of throw anything at it. Some of the predictive policing area is now hilarious because there are agencies that are coming in. They got a lot of military money. Now Iraq is shutting down. They're just going to come and sell it to police departments. So they take 700 variables, they run it all together, and the ones that come out become, the 5 that come out are the ones. I said, well, so you got green fire hydrants predicting where crime is taking place. Great predictor, except it's not going to tell you very much about, you know, really what the problem is. In doing this type of analysis, you can just break these things out. The risk description, identify who, for example, in international terrorism, what you're looking for. International terrorists continue to mount sizable attacks causing significant economic problems. The risk frame, the tentative correlates of that would be things like a government type, state vulnerability, urbanization level, youth percentage, group level correlates. The unit of analysis is terrorist attacks. So you've got a framework that you can then create and identify the types of data that you need and the direction you want to go in terms of analysis. And so we have examples here of organized crime, corruption, even looking at things like factors that would create higher levels of migration. And then these issues related to chronic disease issues seems to me to be natural to this. So if you're thinking about a national or a global analysis of where disease might occur, it's not just simply the pandemic. It's not just the event that's going to be important. It's going to be vulnerability. The vulnerability that comes from things like food price volatility, fiscal crisis, and so on. So all these things are mappable. These things are actually things that you can put into an analysis and you can visualize. And then you go into the person who makes decisions about how much money your department gets next year, and you say, look at this cool map. And they say, yeah, got it. I can see how that works. Not exactly how that works, but anyway. So here's an example of a very specific test that we've been doing. We've looked at armed conflict. Armed conflict there's a lot of good data out on armed conflict. This is particular to the global level. There's a Peace Institute in Uppsala, Sweden that generates a huge amount of data around armed conflict. And they make it available. But this is actually another variable that we're interested in, adverse regime change. So the question is, what are the correlates that will relate to adverse regime change, and then can you map that? Turns out, rule of law risk, regulatory quality risk, accountability risk, control of corruption risk. These actually come out, these types of risks come out of something called the failed state index. Have you heard about this? So failed state index is actually a form of what I'm talking about, except that they don't really do subnational risk assessment. What they're doing is they're doing an analysis across 170 countries. But it's the same strategy. Get the data around these correlates, and then what they do is they rank order these countries in terms of how they fare on these different variables, and they create maps. So we include these. This is actually just for those of you who are following this. This is 1999, 2003, and 2007. And then we create a map. And now, this map actually tells you, or at least attempts to tell you, based on those factors we just saw, which countries were at the highest risk for adverse regime change. And we can see here there's 4 that came up in 2003 based on data from the previous time period. And this is the risk factors on the side. And this is, it turns out that these are actually pretty close. These countries actually did go into that. Now, I don't know how useful it is to be able to predict adverse regime change political scientists like to do this. But the technology, I think, is really important. If you're starting to think about geopolitical risk, you think about doing this in terms of a public health model, a pandemic model. I think that this is very helpful and very interesting. And again, it's based on that technology I just showed you. All you're doing is you're layering the maps. This is made more complicated by the fact that these data are very uncertain. The information that we get from these different countries is doesn't necessarily have high quality control, which is part of the reason that you might end up with some sort of wonky findings. But again, as the data get better, and they will, this type of technology is going to be very, very useful. It's going to be very important for identifying at this level, where the risks are. But the challenge to me, the interesting challenge, is getting down to the subnational level, is really being able to start thinking about, so I'm working from the bottom up when I'm working with crime and crime statistics, right? It doesn't have much impact up higher in terms of those types of correlates. Where bars are located is not going to influence a general national strategy on crime response. But if I'm coming down from this and I'm thinking about organized crime patterns or movement of drugs or other types of things that, terrorism threats, I need to get to the subnational level. And those data are simply not that readily available. But again, if you could get them, the technology and the techniques are available to do this. I should tell you also, by the way, so this is just the follow-up of the later time frame. And you can see it shifts around because these factors will change. So that's good. Where was I going with that last point? Yeah, so the idea is that you're going to be able to take these, use it for subnational, for any level, and then try to make, so that it relies on really getting the better data, getting the better information, and then using this for practical applications. We've used this technique to identify piracy locations where pirates actually attack, and it actually works. It pretty much defines where basically the pirates go to where the opportunities are, so, not surprisingly. But you say, well, don't we already know where those opportunities are? It turns out, well, we don't. That's a lot of this information is information that seems intuitive. It's the same thing when you talk to cops. The cops will tell you, well, I know where the problems are. Yeah, of course you know where the problems are because you keep going there. You just keep going there. Of course, what you're going to say is that's where the problems are because in some ways, because you're arresting people, it looks like there's more problems there, so you're creating more problems and the problem gets even. But that isn't necessarily the best strategy for you to patrol. You may be much more effective, and will be much more effective, if you go to the places that not only where the problems are, but where the likelihood of those factors that will increase that problem will increase. And so you have to know where those are. You don't have that mental map. Well, you may have some of it in your head, but you don't, on an ongoing basis, you don't have that type of mapping capability. And this type of information will give you that. So I've given you quite a stretch going all the way from globalization and risk assessment through common methodology to mapping. But to give you an idea, this is sort of, to me, it's all driven by a need to change the way we think about the threats and the management of the threats. And the strategy we can actually use empirically driven, evidence-based approaches to identify and manage what those resources are that we need to mitigate and prevent these problems. If you're interested in any of the stuff that we're doing, we have a website. We've actually brought these together now, but we do one on crime analysis and one on global threats. And I think I'm done.